Welcome. We're glad to see you here today. I'm Wendy Barker. I'm the museum director, and this is one of our town talks. We have usually about once a month. The next one that we have is September 24th. That's the last day of this current exhibit, and the topic is wildlife in the valley. I think it's going to be a really interesting one, so we hope that you'll come back for that. Then this gallery will be closed for a couple weeks while we put up our new show. And that's an art show with the art of Dennis Shives. If you know him, he's a local artist, does a lot of very cool, interesting things, and that will open in the middle of October, on October 14th. But today, we're here to hear more about the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy. I hope you've had a chance to look at this great exhibit, and we're going to hear about the past, present, and future. Feel free to adjust those chairs. So first, I'd like to introduce Sandy Bueckley. She is the current board president of the Land Conservancy. So, Sandy.
Thank you, Wendy. So I know quite a few of you here. Thank you all very much for being here. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Brian Stark, Executive Director for the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy, and to tell you a little bit about his history with our organization. Many of you already know him, but some of you may not know his background. Brian's 23-year career in land conservation and habitat restoration began as a volunteer with the Land Conservancy of San Luis Obispo in 1994. He served their organization for 16 years, including 5 years as executive director. Brian joined the OVLC in March 2010, serving as conservation and operations director. In this role, he managed day-to-day operations at the Conservancy and designed and implemented habitat restoration projects. During this time, the OVLC acquired 4 important new properties, including the 200-acre Valley View Preserve and the 1-mile-long Steelhead Preserve on the Ventura River. He completed the restoration of Rice Creek on the Ventura River Preserve. Lost my place here. And accelerated the restoration of the Ojai Meadows Preserve. Brian has played a significant role in securing millions of dollars in grants and other funding brought to the Ojai Valley for important open space conservation. Over the years, he has managed 40 habitat restoration and conservation projects along our waterways and trail routes. Brian was selected as executive director in November 2014, and he continues to provide leadership for land conservation and habitat restoration efforts in the Ojai Valley. He's involved at all levels of organizational planning and management, including finance, budgeting, fundraising, project management, and land conservation transactions. He leads a talented and ambitious staff, placing a strong focus on establishing community connections and active partnerships. A top priority for the leadership team is creating an involved community that ensures the permanence of our organization as well as our conservation holdings. Brian grew up in Southern California, but he spent many summers of his youth on his grandparents' cattle ranch in northwest Nebraska, where he learned about ranching, farming, and caring for the land. These experiences led to a lifelong love for the outdoors and interest in land conservation. When not in the office, you might find him hiking, biking, fishing, or playing bass in his local country group, the Three Rivers Band. So join us as Brian presents a look at our 30-year history in the Valley, our current projects, and a glimpse into what lies ahead.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. I am mortal, though. Yeah, Sandy mentioned I work on budgets too, so I thought instead of talking about our past, I'd just talk about the budgeting process tonight. That might be
Good
really,
mapping material.
yeah. I know, can people hear me if oh, I guess they're recording, so I got to use this microphone. Anyway, I've got notes to try and read off of. But anyway, what I hope to go over tonight is just a little bit of history of the Land Conservancy. You know, we're 30 years old this year, so there's actually a lot of it to tell, and it's really a hard story to tell in just a few minutes. What I hope is when I'm done here, people can feel free to ask questions. And I know a lot of you out here have been in Ojai for a long time and have a lot of experience with the Conservancy. And I know Ellen Hall's here, so she represents a good part of our founding. So we can direct the hard questions of the beginning to Ellen later. But anyway, if you want to advance my slide there, Roger. I thought I'd talk just a little bit about, context, and why a land conservancy. Land conservation isn't exactly a new thing. It's been going on since the 1800s. And, for 70 years or 75 years or so, the prime method for protecting land was the government. The government placed a high priority in lands. Teddy Roosevelt, and they were setting aside large swaths of the American landscape for conservation. And, I guess that was a hopeful activity for a lot of us, but that really declined precipitously. By around 1980, we really saw the government moving away from land conservation, so it really did have to go private at that point, and that's where most land conservation is happening today. But land trusts really aren't a new thing either. The first land trust was formed in 1891. They were called the Trustees of Reservations. And this was, not quite the land conservation we think of today, but it started in Massachusetts, and it was this gentleman, Charles Eliot, that had this idea that, faced with, all the growth in, around the Boston area, industrial growth was, going nuts about that time. And they were starting to see a great fragmentation in the landscapes and the natural beauty. And Charles Eliot put out this proposition that land should be protected mainly as an art form, that the natural beauty. I wanted to read a couple of interesting quotes from Charles Eliot because it kind of frames what people were thinking about land conservation back in the 1890s here. And it's funny because their language always sounds so, I wish we still talked like people did back in 1890. I could never be this eloquent. But anyway, he talked about the existing means of securing and preserving public reservations are not sufficiently effective. Lovers of nature will rally to endow the trustees with the care of their favorite scenes, precisely as the lovers of art so liberally endowed the art museums. There's a couple more here. I just find them interesting. The organization will be able to act for the benefit of the whole people and without regard to the principal cause of the ineffectiveness of present methods, namely the local jealousies felt by townships and the parts of townships towards each other. The Commonwealth can no longer afford to refrain from applying to the preservation of remarkable places every method which experience in other fields has approved. So he was looking at all sorts, that as people were endowing art and other parts of society that they felt was necessary, they thought, well, why not apply all these same concepts to land conservation? In all that, you didn't hear anything about climate change or the red-legged frog or anything like that. This was really about something more visceral. It was what you see and the character of your community, and really it kind of was like art. Maybe you could hold this water bottle for me.
Sure.
Juggling's part of my job, but some of the I mentioned a couple other pretty old land trusts. The Save the Redwoods League, they're still quite active today. Michigan Nature Association, and the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. They're all still around, so they really can last a long time. But as the government, like I said, moved out of land conservation, it really did starting to go private. And in basically around 1981, is when the land trust movement, groups like ours, really started happening. Basically, for those of you that, I know most of you are pretty familiar with land trusts in general, but we're privately funded local organizations working to protect local open spaces, and we do that through community support and writing grants. Some of the more mundane and not very interesting parts about the beginning of the land trust movement also involve some legislation. In 1981, the Uniform Conservation Easement Act was passed, and what this did was it made the legal documents that we use to protect land, like conservation easements and people deeding development rights to a nonprofit group, were different in every state. So, and there wasn't a uniform way of the federal government assigning tax deductions for the donation of conservation land. What this Uniform Conservation Easement Act did was it made it uniform across all 50 states and made it much more predictable. And it created the legal basis by which a landowner can donate their development rights for conservation purposes and receive tax deduction. So that's one of the most important tools in our box, really, is that we can foment tax deductions to get our work done. And there were land trusts around in the early 80s. There were about about 430 of them in 1980. The thing was all these land trusts were working in different communities scattered all over the country. They didn't have the internet, so they weren't really finding each other. And so it was this kind of disintegrated group. A couple of meetings were held, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast in 1981, that invited as many of these groups as they could get together to come get together and meet each other. And it was kind of surprising for everybody to figure out that, hey, we're not the only ones doing this, and maybe we could learn from each other. And maybe through that learning, we might get better at our jobs. A nice concept. One of those meetings, they did continue to meet over the next decade, and they formed the Land Trust Exchange. That was active through the 80s, and they renamed themselves the Land Trust Alliance in 1990. And this is a national group that groups like ours belong to, but they really unified and took all these disparate groups and turned land conservation into a movement. And I think that's what really changed, through the 80s. We're not on our own anymore, and we can exchange information and get better at what we do. The LTA now is a group that promulgates the standards for professional land trusts. So now we're all operating in a uniform way, and so our work is a lot more predictable. If you could switch slides on me here, we'll post a couple of charts and graphs. You don't have to read the small print, but the point of these is that the land trust movement's been incredibly successful, and it's grown really quickly. You see in 1981, the 430 land trusts went up to over 1,600 in 2010. The only reason it takes a little dive in 2015 is because they changed the standards for measuring people or groups and decided only to count the effective land trusts, the ones that were functioning. So forming a land trust is like forming any other nonprofit. Most nonprofits don't last. It's sad, but true. So there were a number that weren't functioning. But I will mention at the same time that some of the reduction is starting to happen with land trust mergers. As we get a lot of communities that are nearby each other and they each have their own land trust, they started realizing that, you know, maybe we should all be in this together. There's been projects back east where, you know, 10 land trusts merged together into one and made a statewide power land trust. So that's happening too. But I think what's most impressive is just look at the results. You know, we're looking at 55 million acres of conservation lands permanently protected in America by groups just like us here in Ojai. We can flip pages here. So then we get to the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy. We were started in 1987, and I like this headline, Environmentalists Launching Ojai Valley Land Conservancy, because, you know, today the Land Conservancy is a non-political, sort of a nonpartisan group. But like many land trusts out there, we were formed by environmental activists. And it was because of the nearly constant threats of development of areas that people cared about. So the thought by the group of visionary people was, maybe we can get ahead of some of these development battles and go out and protect the land permanently in advance. And, you know, sort of a novel idea. What I love about this experiment in creating permanent open space, and I love that because that's how land trusts start. And especially in 1987, when land trusts were really pretty new, that nobody knew if it would work. It was, you know, there was a need here in the community, and so, you know, I respect this group of people that had this vision and went forward with it. What's funny, if you've been through the exhibit and you see some of the quotes from our founders, that when they got started, they couldn't just go out and start talking about conservation easements and buying property and doing conservation. They had to explain to the community what open space was. I mean, the conversation was that new, and people thought they were talking about protecting vacant lots. Maybe those are some righteous vacant lots. So the group had to come around this idea and sell to the public this concept that a lot of the land that surrounds us here in Ojai could be built on tomorrow. And, you know, those were the open spaces we were talking about, is regional size, large scale conservation, where you can make a difference in the lives for wildlife and provide some public education and get the community involved. You know, and over the years we grew. You can change our slide here. I didn't expect you to read these stories, but there. But here's Phil Moncharch, one of our early board presidents, and in order to be successful, you know, the OVLC started with little, and so even in 1990, still telling this story, we hadn't picked up a piece of land yet. I guess that's the moment of truth for land trusts like ours, is when you get that first piece of property, you know, it's like, yeah, now we're bona fide, you know. And it's a double-edged sword, because once you get a piece of property and we've promised everybody that we'd protect it for, you know, permanently, it's like, well, dang, now we got to be around forever. So it kind of raises the bar. But in 1990, we're still talking about it and talking about conservation easements. In 1998, the group hired their first full-time executive director, Jim Engel. So a lot of you might have met him. I actually knew Jim back from, we had land trust exchanges when I was in San Luis Obispo. Like, our staff would visit each other and, you know, and exchange methods and what we were doing. So it was always really kind of fun. And what I love this mission possible. That's how it turned out. It turns out after all these years, it was actually possible. You know, the Conservancy was able to do it. In a couple of big projects started happening in 2000. We started gaining some momentum. We're looking at Ojai Meadows Preserve, and Clough Vista Park came around, and these were great opportunities for the Conservancy to meet a lot of people. These were the first big tests of raising a lot of money in the community, because that's what it takes to be successful. We have some of our early board members, and Jim Jackson has also served as executive director of the Conservancy, and their picture is theirs as a reminder that there really isn't anything about the Land Conservancy that doesn't start and end with the community of Ojai. It's people that make this work, and it's not just, there's this larger community, but there's also a leadership factor. And, so since our founding, over 70 local people have served on our board. And I can't overestimate the value of board members throughout the history of the Conservancy, because these are this is a group that's been meeting monthly now for 30 years to chart out the conservation future of the Ojai Valley. And it just wouldn't work without local people coming up and taking some leadership. So here's to all those that, that took leadership positions, because that's what led to where we are today. Our next, once the Ojai Meadows was purchased, now a lot of the times we buy land and it's not in pristine condition. It'd be nice if everything was just awesome and beautiful and we didn't have to do anything. But this was a piece of property that, I guess it was the kind of place where that was where you went to drink beer after school, or ride your dirt bike and tear up some land. I'm not saying those activities aren't fun. It's just where you do it's important. But anyway, I picked this picture mainly because it's got Derek in it, and Derek was with the Conservancy for a long time, and he's just looking particularly macho in this photo. And I didn't tell him I was going to use that photo either. So, but anyway, a thoughtful restoration plan was put together for this property. It kind of speaks to this idea of once you get property, you have to care for it. And anybody who owns property knows that you can't just sit there. I mean, it needs to be actively managed. The restoration work, this is all grant funded or funded through our donor dollars that we raise locally. We don't really spend on habitat restoration. These are grants. But anybody who remembers, does anybody remember the meadows before it was restored? See, a number of you do. And man, if you go out there today, this is a different place. It's a place where, before we started, there was a bird count of about 80 species of birds, and now we're over 180 species of birds. So the restoration work that happened out there sure was a boon to the birds. But it also we still get wildlife usage. We get, all the small mammals. We get bobcats, coyotes, foxes, skunks, raccoons, possums.
Weasels.
A weasel, kind of an unusual creature. I've never seen it in person, but you've seen it? See? Lucky you. You spend too much time over there looking for it. We actually had a mountain lion come through the preserve about a year and a half ago. It was great because they put Nordhoff and Miners Oaks Elementary School on lockdown, and they had all these police standing out there because I was going to go into a school room and take a kid. It's not really how they roll, but I guess it was a good opportunity to visit the preserve and to monitor public safety out there. But the Ojai Meadows too, it does take a lot of management. With the drought we've had over the last couple of years, the eucalyptus are dropping like crazy, and we're having 5 or 7 of them go down in a day sometime during daylight hours when people are out there. So, we've had to do a lot of work to remove a lot of dead trees because they're dying like crazy. And, with restoration, you can see the results now. It's been a decade or so since we started doing this, and it's starting to show. Habitat restoration isn't for the impatient. It's like watching grass grow, literally. Ventura River Preserve, these are a couple shots of the construction of the wetland pond, and kind of a before and after. So you can see magic really happens, and these are our owls down at the bottom, which you could see, so there's a picture of them out here someplace. The owls are almost as popular as the Land Conservancy. I think they have, they're coming up on the same number of Facebook followers. But the wildflowers show some of the work we've been doing, trying to create some natural beauty out there, and trying to get something growing out there that isn't mustard. While the mustard is beautiful when it's in bloom, it's very hazardous when it's not. And some volunteer pictures down below, because hundreds of people, probably thousands, have volunteered to work on the Ojai Meadows over the years to make it what it is today. Next up. Ventura River Preserve, that was a big turning point for the Conservancy too. That's a big project that required the most fundraising that the group had ever done. And to be successful there really kind of put the Conservancy on the map, and by that time then we knew we had to get serious about being around forever. This is just a project that it's kind of hard to visualize with what it looks like today, but how many of you remember the orange orchard that was out on the preserve? So we had 60 acres of oranges when we bought that property, and the Conservancy continued to run the orange orchard as a little business for several years after purchasing it. I dug up some old receipts, and it looks like we made about $2,400 a year doing it. So compared with the value of leaving all that water in the ground, we stopped watering those in 2009. Yet they kept growing just fine until 2012 when the drought really started taking hold. But I know for years they kept me in orange juice on the weekends. Out here, as part of that, when they built the orchard, they took Rice Creek and just put it into a ditch and shot it off a cliff into the Ventura River and dewatered about 1.25 miles of Rice Creek, and then removed about 3/4 of a mile of it to put the orchard in. Since the orchard had died, we took that out in 2015, and we put Rice Creek back where it belongs. That was a fun project. I spent four years working on that. We've probably planted over 50,000 native trees and shrubs out there. It's hard to do restoration in a drought, but it's really starting to take shape out there. If you hit the next slide, this is what the site looks like today. The orange trees are all gone. We actually did this with private fundraising because at the time we did this, we were starting to get Asian citrus psyllid infestations here in the valley, and if the citrus psyllid was found within 800 meters of our trees or on our trees, we would have had to chemically treat the whole place on our dime. So I'd rather spend our money getting rid of the trees. About 4 days before we finished taking out the last tree, we got our letter that said the citrus psyllid was found within 800 meters, so we saved ourselves a chemical dousing. On the top picture here, you can barely see it, but that giant cloud of dust is the masticator that took out the trees. If you ever want to see a fun piece of equipment to watch, this thing just makes mincemeat of a tree in a second. But you can't take a close-up picture because it throws wood like 1/4 mile. What look like bomb craters all through here are oak tree circles. And there's a close-up over here, our planting strategy for oaks, where oaks just die. They have a high mortality rate, so we plant 3 for every one we want to survive. And then we surround it with a little microplant community of shrubs that it's used to growing with, and they help with soil fungus and nutrient transfer and physical protection of the oak trees, and helps us be more successful. So wherever you see these pock marks today, there will one day be a grand oak tree. I'll throw a picture of me in there. This is our first big flow down the new route of Rice Creek after about 90 years. So it's really kind of it was almost an emotional moment when you change history backwards. So this was a fun project, and it's really starting to take shape now. So getting on to some of our current stuff, what's the Land Conservancy do on a daily basis? Well, today we're managing 2,300 acres of open space lands, about 2,000 acres of which are open to the public every day. And that breeds a need for very active management. In some cases, we are still doing some strategic tree planting, but I wanted to throw this photo up because I think that's Rich Hanley there planting a tree. And Rich was our preserve manager for a long time, and he played many roles with the Conservancy over the years, and was kind of a formative person with the Conservancy. And then this smiling gentleman in the middle, those who know us all know Rick well. Rick was such a stewardship director, preserve manager, community icon. He defined what it meant to take care of land in our preserves and to develop the trail systems that we have today. Rick has recently left the Conservancy, and so now we have some really big shoes to fill. But I think what Rick's lasting legacy with the Conservancy will be this high standard of care for the preserves, and we're not going to forget what he put together out there. And so now we have our marching orders. Now we have to see, can we live up to them? But preserve management isn't just something that one guy runs around and does all the time. It's really a community effort, and some of the things that Rick had to deal with on a daily basis, our camping issue. In the early years, we had big problems with homeless moving in on the preserves, but because we've been so regular in managing that, it really hasn't been as big of a problem now. You try and get on these things early before they become a larger mess. The trails that we manage, we're now managing 27 miles of trails locally. Most of those are on our preserves, about almost 20, a little shy of 25 acres of those are on our property. We also have adopted portions of the Gridley Trail, the Pratt Trail, and the Foothill Trail that make loops around our Valley View Preserve. So, we're looking at a time with reduced federal funding, and it's unlikely that the government's going to be taking care of our trails, and so these areas are falling to us as a local group. Pretty much all of our trail work is done by volunteers under the leadership of the Conservancy and particularly Rick for a long time. So it's a community effort. We don't just have somebody sit in an office and just try and figure out what they'll do the next day. Well, Rick's on more speed dials in the Ojai Valley than anybody else, I'm willing to bet. But we have such a great community support, a community that always calls us when stuff's going on. So, no, we don't get tired of getting the phone calls. So when you see something on a preserve that needs to be handled, people call us. And that's really how the scope of work for our management happens, is we need the eyes and ears of our community, and we need the strong backs of our community to make this all work. This was one of our river cleanups down at the Ventura River Preserve. We had 30, 40 people out and took out tons of garbage. This is what comes out of the Happy Valley Drain in Miners Oaks. But there's also all of our signage and infrastructure, fencing, everything that's out there on the preserves needs to be taken care of. That's what we're doing every day. On our land conservation projects, we're constantly working on various projects, and I guess one of the frustrations is you don't always get to talk about them while you're still trying to work them out. We work confidentially with private landowners, and until it's a very ripe project, the community doesn't really hear about it. But at any given time, we're working 5 to 6 different projects. In most of these cases, we're buying land to own it. A lot of land trusts will work with private deed restrictions through what's called a conservation easement. I could talk for an hour on conservation easements, and you might still not completely understand it. It's arcane legal stuff. But in any case, we don't do many of those in the Ojai Valley, and there's a couple constraints to that. And maybe if you have questions later, we could talk about why conservation easements don't really fly around here. But the Land Conservancy doesn't just run around and buy anything. We need to be strategic. So we have certain criteria for the land that we're working on, and these are our conservation criteria. When we do a project, there's sort of, I guess there's this anatomy of a land project and what goes into it, and what do I spend my day doing, trying to protect more land. And a lot of times it's just meeting, first you got to meet a landowner, and sometimes that means just cold calling somebody. But more often than not, we use our community connections. We've prioritized every piece of property over 10 acres in the Ojai Valley. So with a push of a button on a map in my office, I can get a complete workup on its conservation values. So we've done that ahead of time. In fact, we just took all of this work we had done through computer mapping and prepared what's called a conceptual area protection plan for the whole Ventura River watershed. And that describes the conservation values of every property in the area and assigns it a priority for acquisition for conservation. We took that plan and submitted it to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, their Wildlife Conservation Board division, which hands out the money for land conservation, and they adopted that, and it was officially signed about 2 months ago, which opens up a new funding stream, that could potentially bring millions more dollars into the Ojai Valley. So I spent a lot of my time doing, I guess, mundane planning stuff like that. But once we meet a landowner, then it's negotiating a project. We have to, we do a workup, and I have to take this to my board, and we get a preliminary approval, and but we want to make sure that everything we're doing out here has bona fide conservation benefit, and that the community will benefit from it in some tangible way. And then once we're on to that, we're trying to figure out, well, if we want to buy it, where's the money going to come from? In some cases, we can raise the funds locally just with our fundraising. The Valley View campaign for the Valley View Preserve up on the top of Signal Street here, we raised $750,000 there, and the community really showed up for that one. And it's those kind of projects can sell pretty big. Other projects don't generate that kind of community involvement, say if it's not a property that's for public trails or stuff, or it's Casita Springs or something. There's less community interest there. We're working on that. But in any case, so we have to decide how we're going to fund it, and then some of those that are more for habitat that people aren't going to go on, the grants are where we generally look for that. So that we do a lot of grant writing. And then we figure out, can we get public access? Because whenever we can, we like to do that, because every land trust kind of reflects a little part of their community's values. And our community really values being able to walk out on the land and enjoy it. People in Ojai have a very close connection to the land, and so whenever possible, that's how we want to protect land. Well, then once we get land, then we turn people loose on it. I like this. So we don't just let nerds onto the preserve. We let this is our one of our bird watching tours. Along the way, though, we are for each project we purchase, we also have to do all these mundane things to, we have to have the mineral rights researched. We have to have research on the land of whether it's ever had a toxic spill on it or anything. So those aren't very exciting. I could talk for, what's that?
This is actually the natural.
Oh, is that CalNat? Yeah. So that's another thing we're doing. Thank you, Stuart. But
For next year.
yeah, but anyway, these are just a few pictures of people out enjoying the land. And, this is kind of what it's about in Ojai. People really like to get out there. This is going up. I think that's our Valley View Preserve. See where I'm in my notes. So here's just some of the recent projects we've been working on. Our newest land project is the trail easement we got through property owned by the Krishnamurti Foundation of America. It's on the map over here. It's the Ojai Meadows is at the top right, but we negotiated trail access through, and what that did is it joined two new neighborhoods to the preserve. So that's part of our priorities here too. Is how can we connect our open spaces? This is a pretty important piece of property for Ojai. When you drive into Ojai, this is the scenic gateway that you drive past coming into Ojai. I think it's a critical piece of open space. Right now, it's privately owned. They're not interested in selling, but they're a great neighbor, and we've been able to work with them on this trail thing, and it's been pretty successful. We've adopted a couple of trails. One thing that you didn't hear about in the news necessarily because it wasn't terribly exciting was that on the Fuel Break Road trail, we recently renegotiated 2 of those easements to clarify some weaknesses in the early easement language that was put in there, and it created some potential future problems out there. So sometimes we're still looking back at old projects, figuring out how do we make them better. In terms of our priorities going forward, so since I can't tell you exactly what projects I'm working on right now, I can tell you what they're about. So we're looking at projects that will enlarge 2 of our existing preserves. As we look to strategy of where we want to go with conservation in the next coming years, growing our own preserves is a high priority. Because we're already mobilized there. These are the most cost-effective additions we could make. And we're really striving for something that's a landscape scale conservation. So the larger land masses we can lock up for conservation, the better those are for wildlife passage, adaptation to climate change. Oh yeah, by the way, climate change is real. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, you heard it first here. So linking our existing preserves, if we can't pick up the land in between, can we get trail connections? We are looking at a project that would protect 400 acres of critical habitat for California red-legged frog. And that's kind of important. They're in this one unit of frog protection area that's designated federally, it's 1,500 acres, but we could take down 1/3 of that in one deal. So I think the frog thing's kind of sexy. Maybe not for everybody else, but the project would also provide for some interesting public access opportunities. We're looking at a foothill meadow that happens to have a public trail going through that has not completely clear public access on it. So in doing the conservation of this area, we can revisit the public access of an existing trail and try and make sure that it's all legally documented. And we're also looking at a couple that protect some important landscapes that we view from the city. Just as the original land conservationists back in 1890, we are concerned with natural beauty and what our town looks like. It's our land that really kind of defines our community. A couple bottom pictures. We're redoing the Pratt Trailhead here. It had fallen into disrepair, and the federal government didn't have any funding to fix it. And we actually did this because when we bought the Valley View Preserve, we had no idea how popular it was going to be. And so we got quickly overwhelmed and created a parking problem on Signal Street. I guess we could have thought about that in advance, but who knew that it was going to be that popular? So anyway, we figured if we could fix up Pratt Trailhead, we could maybe get some people to park over there. They can still hike up onto the preserve, and that actually worked. We were able to work with our neighbors and get most of the traffic problem handled. This other picture here is an easement we recently took on the trail to Matilaha Falls. That's a trail that's kind of been fraught with some disagreements with landowners over the years, and there's still a lot of work, I think, to be done out on the trails out there in terms of solidifying public access. And while the Conservancy doesn't get involved in activism and the lawsuits and all that kind of thing, we kind of stay out of all the trail fights up there. But when there's a resolution to be had and someone needs a legal mechanism to affect public access, they look to the Land Conservancy to do that. And so that's kind of our role. I want to share a little more esoteric thing that we work on is, the permanence of land conservation, does, place a lot of burden on the Conservancy to ensure that we're here forever. We're working on our endowment, but we're not vastly rich. What we have going for us is a strong organization and a supportive community that gets us going every year. But as part of our permanence, we find that strengthening our organization sort of from the inside out is really important. Sometimes it's not so much just going out and protecting land, it's having the mechanisms to defend it over time. We're 30 years into the land trust business, and a lot of the easements that have been donated or purchased, or the lands, are still owned by the original donor. But in the next 10 years, most of the conservation land that's been protected around that's private is going to change hands. And it's usually the second and third landowners who don't like the conservation easement. They say it's not if you get a violation and have to go to court. It's more about a when. So we only have 2 conservation easements right now, so that's not huge. But we do have, we have neighbors that will encroach on the property or damage the property. So anyway, having the strongest possible organization to protect the lands and to defend them if need be means we have to have strong standards and practices. And I put this up because starting about, I think it was, I don't even remember now, over a decade, maybe 50, so when the accreditation program started. But there came a time in the land trust business that not all land trusts were coming out and being perfectly ethical. The developers were creating their own land trusts, and they were putting conservation easements on golf courses and taking huge tax deductions. I don't think that's what any of us think about when we think about giving a tax deduction, which is we the people's money to protect a golf course. But anyway, the Land Trust Alliance had a spin-off group, an accreditation commission that's independent of the Land Trust Alliance, but it regulates and certifies your compliance with standards and practices of professional land trusts. The Land Conservancy was accredited last year, so we're really proud of that. It puts us, out of the 1,600 land trusts we have out there today, it puts us in the top 350 of them for implementing the highest standards. So that's one way we can honor our past a little bit is by really making this organization the best it can be, because we really owe it to the community of Ojai. So the future is just one slide because it hasn't happened yet, so I don't have a whole lot to show you, but a couple of things that stick out to me and where we're going to be going in the next 30 years. First of all, man, there's still a lot to protect here in the Ojai Valley. So there's no shortage of important land to go protect. This is our priority map. This map really hasn't changed since I got to the Conservancy. In all that process we did to do the big conservation plan for our watershed, when it all came out and we looked, well, how does it stack up against our priorities? Very closely. So the priorities are still very solid, so there's no real compelling reason to change them. I think most of our most of our conservation is going to be privately driven. I think the government's out of business for land conservation, at least around here. We're seeing, I guess, confronting what's happening now is, I mean, the U.S. Forest Service has had decreased funding for many, many years. That's not a new thing. I think a lot of people thought, oh, well, with the current administration, we're not going to see a lot of funding for the Forest Service, but they've been cut pretty seriously for many years. But I don't know that we can, but we certainly won't expect any growth in this area in the next, I don't know, I wouldn't hazard a guess. In any case, I think we're on our own. So it does make us think about all the public trails that we enjoy here in the Ojai Valley, and how many of those are on national forest land, and who's going to take care of them now. We've adopted a few of them, trying to measure our capacity to take care of them. I don't know that we can take care of all of the government's business, but I think over time, the local community is going to have to look at ways to realize what they love about these trails and figure out a way to organize around maintaining them. And I think the Conservancy, for our part, as trail advocates, I think we're looking at ourselves as well. It looks like it's us, probably, because we do trails, and we're happy to try and do everything we can. As we pick up more property, and we will be, we do have to look at, what does management of that property mean for us? Ideally, we would have this huge endowment that would pay for the management of all of our open space. And one day we will, and that'll be a grand day. We're building on it now. We have an endowment of about $600,000 now set aside for the care and feeding of these preserves, but we need a lot more of that for the long term. So we're going to have to look at, we can no longer afford to do projects where we don't raise the endowment funds at the same time as we raise the funds to buy the property. So, and we've been doing that since I got here. All the projects we've done, we've raised the funds to do that. We have these brown swatches up here because early on in the Conservancy's formation, we were looking at the importance of agricultural land and the importance of agriculture to our economy and our culture and what Ojai is. Agricultural land isn't something that the Conservancy probably wouldn't be buying agricultural land. We're not farmers, and my limited experience on the family ranch does not qualify me to be a major farmer or rancher in this area, but most of the ag conservation that happens in the, throughout the country is done by conservation easement, where the development rights are donated off the property to a land trust so the land could stay in agriculture. We have some economic issues with the conservation easements. The way they establish value is by what rights you give up. And Ventura County has really restrictive land use zoning laws, and we have the SOAR initiative here. So basically nobody has anything to give up on ag land. They don't have much rights to do anything with it besides plant it. So there's no value in giving up rights to permanently restrict the uses on the land. So in some respects, the SOAR initiative has probably protected a lot of land, but it's protecting it temporarily and kind of preventing permanent protection. So I don't know how that'll work out, but that'll be an issue that happens. That's a political issue that we'll have to look at in the coming future. I still think that there are a few places here in the valley where the economics of a conservation easement will work. And as y'all know, land isn't really cheap in Ojai and in the valley. So every year it gets more and more expensive to protect it. I feel like at some point we have to come around and figure out a way to make conservation easements work in this valley, because otherwise I think we're missing big opportunities. I don't know that I have the answer for that, but it's something that we'll have to keep an eye on and try and work politically to do. And the last thing is really just to continue to build public support. I think right now we feel like we're probably about as supported as we ever have been in the community. We have about 1,200 households that are supporting the Conservancy today. But we do have this lofty dream of, what if everybody who went on the preserve joined the Land Conservancy? I'm sure that would be helpful. We don't have a good grasp of how many do, but it's a small percentage. Most of the care of the open spaces around here is basically that 1,200 households, are covering for the other 30,000 of you out there that are doing it. So we're committed to continuing to build on our local support, and when we get opportunities to stock that endowment for future care. That's basically how it comes out to me. I thought it might be more interesting to talk more about your questions, or if Sandy, if you wanted to add anything here. No. I've been talking for a long time.
Would you like a sip of water?
Yeah.
You have some questions from the audience?
Yeah, grill me. Let's go. All right.
Judy.
My first awareness of this thing called conservation came in the 70s, I think, maybe 80s, when I became aware of something called the Nature Conservancy, which is, well, actually, it's not just a national organization, it's an international organization. And I joined it, and I gave a great deal of thought to my preference that people take charge and they value land, they want to preserve land and habitat and stuff, and go out, raise the money and buy it. Because governments change, administrations come and go, and Congress comes and goes, and priorities come and go. But if you own the land and you maintain your organization, then it's permanent. What relationship does the Nature Conservancy have to stimulating the beginning of the conservation?
Well, the Nature Conservancy, they're multinational. In fact, they're one of the largest nonprofits in the world. I think obviously they thought big, and they were great at fundraising and bringing this whole idea together. I think most groups like ours, owe some sense of our existence to a group that pioneered that on a large scale. But again, they're large, and they went through some transitions too. Back in it was the late 90s, they'd acquired so much land that they were starting to buckle under the weight of its management. And that's the same basic thing I was talking about, of us making sure we can always take care of the land that we've protected. They were finding that to be difficult, and so much of their resources became tied up in land management. So they actually did quite a large divestment of conservation holdings, and they contacted groups like ours, local land trusts, to take over the local management of property. And I think that made a lot of sense. I know when I worked in San Luis Obispo, we took over a couple conservation easements and some properties from them. And they know the game. So that property that they gave to us came with small endowments for us to take care of it. So they weren't dumping land on local groups. We wanted to manage these lands, and in some respects, some land trusts picked up more property from the Nature Conservancy than they protected themselves, and it did build capacity of the local land trust business. So, I think they've been helpful. For our part, I'm always in touch with the Nature Conservancy one way or another, just for talking about regional conservation issues. And still as a local group, we kind of think of hey man, we're on the ground locally and we're doing it. We're a lot less bureaucratic because there's only 5 of us in the office every day, so we have less forms to fill out. But they're still national leaders and doing terrific work.
Yeah,
they did was, they actually bought houses and provided low-income housing. I'm wondering if that still exists in the land trust movement, and if you guys would ever even consider such a thing?
In the land trust business that we're in, and the Land Trust Alliance kind of oversees, we're just basically doing land conservation. There are still housing trusts, though, and so I think there's, once in a while, there's some confusion about, this type of land trust versus that kind of land trust, but in a way, what makes us similar is if you look at this very top level, we're just social realtors. We're out doing land deals to make public good. And so the housing trusts, are making it possible for, people to get into homes. It's just like if we were, conserving agricultural land and make sure that people could still farm. So these things that have value to society, groups can do it by putting up their money to buy tangible real estate assets.
I had heard that there was like 125 million trees died in California because of the drought. And I was wondering, in terms of the Conservancy's holdings, how much that's affected you and what you've done. Like you mentioned, some of the ones in the meadow you cut down because they were a hazard. But how do you deal with things that you've lost in other areas?
Well, I think when we're looking at what's happening on the preserves, nature happens, droughts happen, and we took a beating from 5 years of drought. We probably lost 25 mature old live oak trees at the Ventura River Preserve alone. The tangible thing that caused this is a lot of time on a chainsaw to open the trails back up. But in most cases, those lands can recover on their own. If in areas where it's not recovering, we may look at intervening with restoration activity. For us, we don't have the capacity to go manage every tree out on 2,000 acres, but it's really about what's at risk. So the Ojai Meadows, I've got hundreds of people out there every day and classes of elementary school kids. I guess a tree coming down on a class of kids is bad press, but it's also a horrible tragedy that is preventable. So we decided to go cut all those trees down because we wanted to control that. I'll tell you, it scares the heck out of us when I hear that they're going down across our trails in the middle of the day. So it also complicates our budget because I probably dropped $15,000 of unbudgeted money to take those trees out. So sometimes we have to be ready for dealing with what nature throws our way. I think our oaks will recover here in the valley if we get some decent rain, but at the same time, in a changing climate, what can we really expect? I think the oak tree is about as climate adapted as a tree can get. I know when we're doing our habitat projects, we're no longer looking at yesterday and yesteryear for models of what we're trying to build out there. We can't put history's habitats back together. They just simply, the climate isn't for them anymore. So we're adapting plant palettes. We're starting to mix genetic phenotypes, which is a horrible genetics term that you won't understand, but it's, like a tree in Piru is going to be more adapted to dryness than a tree in Ventura, but they're the same species. So if you planted a Piru plant, maybe you get the same functional habitat by putting some adapted genetics out there. So that's one of the esoteric ways that we're looking at trying to handle these things. When I started in the habitat restoration business, 23 years ago, whatever, it was unheard of not to use purely local genetics. But I think the ecology field's having to think a lot more broadly now. Surely there must be something else. Yeah. Yeah, it's up from Valley View Preserve.
Was that this year, Brian?
Yes, yeah,
It was,
that
yeah.
was this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can never count on the wildflowers. You never know when you're going to get them or not. So, and in some years it goes off here, sometimes it goes off there. But
Okay. Brian, I know years ago, there was some conversation about the Land Conservancy getting involved with green burials. Is that issue dead, or?
pun intended. In all the time I spent preparing for tonight, I never thought anybody would ask me this question. But it's true, there is a thing called green burial, and maybe you've heard about it, but some people want to be buried without all the chemicals and all the things that go with it. So there actually are land trusts in the United States that are purchasing land and using it to do ecologically sound burials. So I guess, the high end, you might get the pine box or a simple cotton shroud. They don't do embalming or anything. I never thought I'd be talking about this. But at the same time, there's a demand for this in a lot of parts of the country. And it was brought up to the Conservancy because there really isn't any place to be buried in Ojai. We're kind of full. And so the thought was maybe there's an opportunity for this because it's kind of lucrative. So, I mean, it's attractive, and it was brought up not in any morbid sense or because we were thinking that we were going to break new ground and for the Chamber of Commerce, but it was really about that constantly thinking about strategies to permanently make sure our land is cared for. And in the absence of a mega endowment, here was an idea that that came around with some dollars attached, and we thought maybe people in Ojai might get it. And there's actually a green burial council, and the person who runs it lives here in Ojai, so it's a local thing. I can't say there was universal excitement on our board about this because it is kind of a weird thing, but I guess for the short-term cricket, I'm not really looking at that, but that could.
Might dig it up in the future.
But yeah. Yeah, good.
I just want to ask about the frogs in the preserve. Have you ever considered closing the preserve for a short period of time while all the frogs were everywhere? It was horrible to watch everybody trampling over these little baby frogs everywhere.
At the meadows.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
In other places, they do close even roads when there's a migration of critters like that. And I'm wondering, did you consider that, or would you consider it?
I would consider some modification of the routes of where people walk. That phenomenon hasn't happened for a bunch of years, and so it only happens every couple of years that you get that size of a hatch because of how much water is in any of our wetlands at a certain time of year. But yes,
It was only on certain paths.
Yeah, on
so
certain
we
paths,
could
but
control it.
my sense is that yes, that's a management capacity that we have, and I agree. I mean, a lot of those are. I mean, frogs have a tough life, but yeah, I think we can probably temporarily move some trails because we have the space to do it. I mean, there's some pinch points where that's going to be really hard, right over by Nordhoff where the drain is. That's a hard place to rope off. But no matter where we move the people to, it's hard to herd the frogs. The frogs are never where you want them to be, but they are really cute, and they're a big, they're a part of our ecology on the preserve, and not at the preserve. We don't have, the only endangered frogs here in the valley are the California red-legged frog. We have some appropriate habitat for them. Conceivably, they could be there, but they're not. We're so far from other wetlands that they don't come over to look. A red-legged frog, though, can hop a mile overnight. So, but they're larger. They're like a bullfrog size almost when they get big. So they're, what we have out at Ojai Meadows are the Pacific tree frogs and the toads. So,
Obviously, people are important to the connection and the mission with the Conservancy. How do you foster the connection of people to nature and equally as important to conservation?
Well, I think that's kind of critical, not just to what we do today, but how land conservation happens in the future. We need to have people engage with the outdoors, because if people don't care about it, they're not going to fund its protection, and they're not going to care about its protection. And that's something the land trust movement's been worried about for a long time, as we start seeing generations, more plugged into a telephone or a screen or a video game and going outside. I might have been the last generation to get kicked out every morning and told not to come back till dinner. Interestingly, the best predictor of what makes somebody a supporter of conservation environment later in life boils down to unstructured outdoor play before the age of 11. They studied this. But our preserves allow people to go out and do whatever, not whatever they want. They can't have fires and kill animals, but people go out and can enjoy the preserve in their own way. So we are constantly trying to get people to go outside, join us on our hikes and our other outdoor events. A funny thing happened, though, in the last year. We've been asking people to come outside and enjoy the outside for so long. And we're thinking, why don't people come out more? And this year we got overwhelmed in some places. Our swimming holes, for instance, at Ventura River Preserve, some days, 150 people there. People coming from, Thousand Oaks and Oxnard to come up to the Ojai swimming holes. And it's like, wow, why did that happen? Well, it's Instagram. Instagram is causing a huge number of young people to come out and see natural wonders. And that's a challenge for land managers like us. It's like, please, Paris Hilton, don't do a selfie on our preserve. Because what happens is, they take the selfie at the swimming hole. Now, we've never advertised the swimming holes at the preserve. They're not on our maps. They're not in the brochure. They're not on the website. Those are things that are just because when you get so many people there, it creates a management challenge. Well, it's no longer, you can't control people by not putting stuff on your website anymore because everybody's got a marketing machine in their pocket. So, I don't know, I'm trying to look at it as an opportunity. Okay, this year we were a little bit surprised. Maybe next year we won't be surprised. We'll be methodical. And we'll see if we can interact with those people and see if we can start generating some conservation support out of this newfound interest in the outdoors. But I think engagement's always going to be changing, and I guess that's why we can't be completely static in what we do. I'm really happy to have all these people coming to our preserve. We just have to put out the messaging about how to use places respectfully. And it is something too, we're interested in broadening the diversity of groups using our preserve too. And the swimming holes are the most diverse group of people that you'll see on our preserves. And I see that as a big opportunity to start spreading our mission, to new parts of our population.
Speaking of swimming holes, that reminded me of the Matilla hot springs. You guys ever looked into buying that land?
We have actually. we looked at it a couple years ago before the recent buyers bought it. It's kind of a problematic site. First of all, the survey out there is inaccurate, so nobody actually knows who owns it. So going out and buying something that you don't know where the property lines are is hard for us because we have to commit to defending it. So that was a challenge for us. Now, normally we just go do a survey and figure that out, but at the time there was no survey up the canyon, which means you'd have to tie into benchmarks down at Highway 33. We'd probably be looking at a survey bill of over $100,000. So the land isn't worth $100,000. So, yeah, I guess we can't get them all. I mean, I think it's a neat site, and it offered something, but it also offered a complicated management regime. And
Structures too.
yeah, and the community has a relationship with that place. It's a hard place to go and just do what you think is right, because you have a whole community that feels a sense of ownership for it. So it's politically fraught. I mean, that shouldn't scare us away from doing a project, but there were a number of things that stacked up on it that it was hard to get our heads around as a group that is more, methodical, and yeah, we need our survey, we need that. But a piece of property worth conserving, though, and and at the time, it was horribly thrashed. So it's hard to say what you do out there. Last chance to zing me. How about we got Cricky?
As someone who has lived in the valley for a while, we've seen there were trails that had been used for 100 years or so, and then private owners would come and put up a fence and get dogs and what have you. And we've seen there was some point in the Ojai history when our trails were being diminished. And I, for one, am so grateful for the Ojai Land Conservancy, because I have seen in my tenure here, it goes from fewer and fewer trails to more and more trails. And the fact that the Land Conservancy has just made it possible for those of us who like to get out and walk these trails. It's just a whole new world, and it's a lot of work. It was a lot of tender loving care goes into that, a lot of community support, but it's really added to the quality of life here in this valley. I think everybody here in this room is just so grateful for the Land Conservancy and the wonderful role it's playing in our valley today.
Well, we appreciate that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, communities create land trusts, I guess, in their own vision. And we are doing what we're doing around trails is because that's what you want. And we're not this monolithic agency or organization that just sits out there and decides for ourselves what people care about. It's the community drives everything here. And if the community wants trails, and we have the capacity to do them, that's what we're going to do. We like doing that. Well, we've also, I don't know if it's on this other map, but if you look at the distribution of some of our preserves, you'll see that we have quite a number of preserves that are adjacent to the forest land and private property. So we're specifically looking at those properties that lie between the government land, the public land, and private land, because once you get private land next to public land, you get a blockage of access potential. So if we can try and secure as many possible adjacent pieces to the Forest Service, then we control the access to the public land. And if trails are lost to private properties blocking off trails, we can develop alternatives if we have a good number of other adjacent properties. So that's a specific criteria. We're actively looking specifically at projects that meet that public-private interface. And so now we're the public, kind of public, if you think of us that way. Did you have another question, Mickey?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about your 1% for Ojai thing and what kind of inspiration for that was? I didn't see it much in other parts of the country.
Yeah, well, it's been renamed to Wild About Ojai, but it's a business affinity program, but it offers an opportunity for people that are, visiting merchants in town to donate 1% of their bill to land conservation. We didn't make this up. You've probably heard of 1% for the planet. It's a little bit different because those are corporations giving 1% of their profits. This is actually, the businesses aren't donating, the customers are. But they were doing that up in Truckee. The Truckee Donner Land Trust was doing it. They had a program started in Colorado that got so big and spread out that they separated into their own nonprofit, and they service multiple land trusts now. So it's an interesting program. That's a big one to try and launch in the community. It's been pretty successful, though. Those funds go directly to our land management. I think people understand that it's an opportunity to give just a little bit along the way. Ojai is a major tourist destination, so we get a lot of visitors. And it's an opportunity to try and tap into some of our visitors that are coming here to enjoy the open space, to make small contributions. The actual average contribution that a donor makes, a customer makes on that might be, $1 or less, probably more like 25 cents. So it's not a whole lot of money. I'm guessing it's raised maybe around $90,000 since we started the program. And that's been a big boon to our land management program. We also have a business sponsors program where local businesses make donations. So in that case, the business is making the donation. We've seen a lot of growth in that in the last year and a half. So it's beating budget expectations. So that program also is for our preserve care, and that generates. So we generate with those two programs together maybe $50,000 a year toward our land management. The land management for all these properties isn't inexpensive. We're spending about $120,000 a year running this preserve system. And those are carried as operating costs for the Conservancy. So it keeps us on edge, in terms of our fundraising and always being active that way. Over time, we hope as the endowment grows, we get a little bit of relief in that area, and we don't have to spend quite so much of our yearly fundraising on the land management.
I just wanted to say, we volunteered last weekend in the Patagonia parking lots.
Oh, right on.
And, but what I wanted to say is, first I want to thank Patagonia for offering the opportunity, but also every single person that parked there, when we told them about that we were from the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy and the monies were going to that, they were all like, oh, it's for Ojai Valley. This is great, that's great. I'm happy to give. You have a wonderful reputation. And these were just people coming to the fair, and they were from all walks of life. And there was one gentleman who even was like, I don't think he spoke much English, but as soon as he heard Ojai, he goes, Ojai! So we really, I think it was just a wonderful opportunity to be out there and to hear from the public that everybody loves this group. So.
That's great. Thank you for doing that. That raised about $5,000 for the Land Conservancy, just that one day parking at the fair.
Yeah. Well, maybe tell them next time to bring 2 cars.
Exactly.
So are we up against our time here?
Yeah.
all. I think a lot of you are already probably members, but I learned a few things. So.
Good, we should. Well, and I want to thank you, Wendy, and Don and Roger for all of the work and support that you gave us to put this exhibit on in this room, and for the opportunity for us to come and talk to people this week, and when Rick came and talked, and also like to put another plug in for Jenny Fitzgerald's talk.
September 24th.
September 24th, and Brian can maybe talk a little more about what she's going to bring us. She's a young biologist. She created that display behind you.
Yeah, so Jenny's a biologist and works in the Santa Monica Mountains, tracking the mountain lions. So she's in the field following lions. I mean, it really doesn't get much cooler than that. It's cooler than what I do in front of a computer every day. But she helps us manage our game camera program. We're starting, even just after the first week of putting these cameras out on our preserves, we were just amazed at what's actually out by our trails. And some of these, like on this display, there's about a 450 to 500 pound bear. And that thing's walking down the same trail as you guys are. So
Different hours.
yeah, that's why the preserves are closed at sundown. But thanks so much. I hope you'll come out to that one too. And